So thank you for having me. I'm very excited to present my work to an immigration audience, and I'm looking forward to your comments. So please interrupt me at any time. So let me start with a bit of a broader motivation. We often see the following situation, especially throughout the Western world, especially in the US. What we see is basically different sides of the political debate using different language to refer to the exact same issue. So most recently, we've been hearing about the Chinese virus from the Republican side versus COVID-19, which is the more conventional name. We've been hearing about the death tax from the right versus the estate tax from the left. And in the domain of immigration, illegal aliens versus undocumented citizens. So I will refer to this phenomenon as slanted language. And the question that I want to study in this project is essentially whether this is effective. So if this is so widespread in political rhetoric, does it actually work to persuade the audience of the position kind of implicit in this language? Now, this is somewhat of a difficult question empirically for several reasons, but just to name a few, slanted language is, of course, kind of a choice variable of the speaker and of the media that transmits the message. So it can be accompanied by other types of biases, such as selective coverage of certain issues. If you refer to if you refer to immigrants as illegal aliens, maybe you also give more coverage to immigration issues. Maybe you give more speaking time to the Republican side of the debate, and maybe you directly endorse policies that aim to restrict immigration. So these kind of biases come together. They are determined simultaneously, and they're also, from previous research, we know that they are also determined in consideration of the pre-existing preferences of the audience. So we have kind of a simultaneity issue, and we have a reverse causality issue if you want to understand the effect of these things on attitudes of the audience. So the approach that I try to take in this paper to solve these empirical challenges is the following. I will try to exploit the fact that whereas media outlets produce a lot of their content independently, they also copy-paste a large portion of it from newswires. So in the Associated Press, in the US, this will be the Associated Press newswire, which produces content that can be used by newspapers as they wish, so it can be copy-pasted into their outlet. And what is convenient for me is that I will exploit a particular change in the language distributed by the Associated Press. And why I think this is useful is that this change is plausibly exogenous to the preferences of an individual outlet, given that the Associated Press serves all US media, so think of thousands of news outlets. So the preferences of an individual one are unlikely to be determining this change. Then the second useful feature of this setting is that media outlets differ greatly in the extent to which they rely on the Associated Press. So this will give me kind of a treatment and control group. So I will be comparing the language used by media outlets that rely on the Associated Press a lot versus less so before and after this change. And I will be also comparing the attitudes of their respective readers before and after a change. So in particular, as I already anticipated, I will be studying a particular change, which will be a ban on the term illegal immigrant in the Associated Press. And respectively, I'll be looking at attitudes on immigration. Okay, so where does this contribute? I think this fits into a large literature on media and media persuasion. So by now we have a lot of evidence from the following experiments. So usually we see papers exploiting idiosyncrasies in access to a particular biased outlet. For example, Fox News the Washington Post versus the Times. Yeah, you have papers on Russia and on Italy. So it's pretty established that getting access to a particular biased outlet can play a role for voting behavior. It's less clear how this happens. So there are a few exceptions that look at the role of volume of coverage of a particular issue or the role of endorsements. So I will be looking at a more subtle, I would say, channel, which is slanted language. Then there is also a very important paper that I will be referring to by Genskov and Shapiro that studies media slant. But the focus there is on the determinants of slant. And as I mentioned, the pre-existing preferences of the audience turn out to play a big role. In contrast to this paper, here I will try to study the consequences of slant. So the reverse direction of causality there. Then there is also recent literature documenting huge misperceptions on the issue of immigration that I think you might be familiar with. And in survey experiments, people have sometimes tried to correct these misperceptions and see what happens to policy preferences, and they do seem to react. So I think my paper relates to these studies, but the difference is that rather than an information treatment, I will be studying more of a framing treatment in my natural experiment. And finally, framing is a huge literature on its own, but it's relatively rare to study framing in observational studies rather than experiments, and that's what I will be doing here. Okay. Any questions so far?
Well, so far it doesn't seem like it is the case, so carry on, please.
Okay, good. So I think, so I'll proceed in 3 steps. First, I'll try to give you an idea of what the ban was, why it happened, and how it affected the language distributed by the Associated Press. Then in the second step, I will look at how the ban diffuses into different media outlets. And lastly, I'll turn to the effects on policy preferences. Okay, so the ban on illegal immigrant. So first of all, just to give you some idea, some of you might be familiar with this already, but just in case, I want to give you an idea of why the term illegal immigrant is controversial in the first place and why it was banned by the Associated Press. So this is, first of all, an extremely partisan phrase. So if you look, for example, in congressional speech and compare the frequency of illegal immigrant mentions over immigrant mentions by Democrats and Republicans, you see that it's used way more frequently by Republicans. And in fact, this can be traced back to an explicit strategy by Republican pundits, such as this guy called Frank Luntz, who sent in memos to the Republican Party. Yeah, he pushed this strategy to always refer to illegal immigrants and to highlight the issue of border security, which is favorable to the Republican Party. And this is not only the case in the speech of politicians. If you look at media outlets, for example, here I am comparing the left-leaning MSNBC versus the right-leaning Fox News. You see a similar change in, a similar difference in usage of the term, and same thing for the Washington Post versus the Washington Times. Okay, so the Associated Press, given that it serves outlets from across the ideological spectrum, usually tries to be pretty neutral in their language that they put out. So in 2013, after several years of resisting requests by immigrant rights activists to change their language, they finally gave in and they decided to ban the term illegal immigrant, as it was becoming more and more partisan. So you were no longer in an AP dispatch to other media, you were no longer allowed to use the term illegal immigrant. What you were supposed to say instead is entered the country illegally or without legal permission. And I'll come back. So I'll come back to this phrasing later. As you might imagine, this is quite a bit more difficult to use in text, especially in the headline. So we'll be looking at that. Okay, so now I will show you some descriptive evidence on what happened to the language of AP. So let's start with looking at the headlines. You have on the left-hand side the headlines of immigrant dispatches released before the ban. So clearly the label illegal features very prominently, and after the ban it seems to disappear. And the timing of this change coincides very precisely with the timing of the ban. So here I am plotting the monthly share of illegal immigrant over immigrant dispatches released by AP. And as you can see, this drops very sharply from about 50% before the ban to something like 5% after. And I should say the reason this is not zero is that you should still keep using illegal immigrant in direct quotes. So if Donald Trump says illegal immigrant, this will show up here as non-zero.
Sorry, Milena, if I may interrupt you. Celine is asking, how is the decisions, how are they taken in the Council of Editors at AP?
So the decision on the ban, you mean?
Yeah, she's asking whether there is a political influence on these decisions and how are they decided.
So unfortunately, I don't have a lot of information how this happened specifically, but what I do know is that this was somewhat unexpected for the reason that it was a direct request to the AP by immigrant rights activists. So there is, for example, one group called, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the name of the group, but they were pressuring AP ever since 2010 to change their language, and AP was resisting this. So in fact, they were pretty late with their ban, and they took this decision at a time when illegal immigrant was already a term that was considered somewhat politically incorrect. So that's on the timing. The other evidence that I have is that the AP serves more than 1,000 media outlets in the US. So from the perspective of individual one, this is unlikely to be driving the whole story.
I see. And also somebody else is asking you whether this changing policy was received among readers. So basically whether or not you are capturing the real change or the announcement of the change.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are many questions. I don't know, maybe after this answer, we can probably ask them later, but you could answer to this second question.
So on whether it's the announcement or if the announcement play a role, so for sure the ban was not a secret, but my impression from the evidence that I'll show you, especially the timing of the effects that I see, I think it probably does not play much of a role. So yeah, I think if you were interested specifically in the Associated Press and what they're doing, you might be aware of the change. If you're just reading your local newspaper, it's unlikely that affects you directly. It's more of a change in, so it's a permanent change in how newspapers write on the issue of immigration, compared to perhaps a small one-time announcement that AP did something. So yeah, so I don't have any hard evidence on this, but my sense is that the announcement itself may have played some role, but it should be small, if any.
Thank you. I also have a question on this, but I will ask it later. Please carry on. Thank you.
Okay, then let me show you a few more things. So this is the frequency of this one term. And you might be asking yourself, is this part of a broader trend? So is perhaps AP becoming more liberal on average, rather than just regarding the use of this one phrase? So to answer this question, what I can do is to compute a measure of slant. Here I am following Janskov and Shapiro. And the simple intuition is that I am trying to get a numerical measure of how similar the phrases, so the language used by the Associated Press is to an average Republican or an average Democrat speaking in Congress. So that's what I'm doing here, with this slant measure being higher if it's more similar to Republican relative to Democrat speech. Okay, so in the red line, I am computing the slant index, including all of the totality of AP's text. And as you can see, this follows very precisely the previous graph. And that's because the term illegal immigrant is extremely predictive of partisanship in Congress. Once, however, I exclude the term illegal immigrant, so I'm trying to focus on other dimensions of language, we see not much of a change. So this tells me that that this change in the use of illegal immigrant does not seem to be accompanied by another change in slant. Similarly, I find no change in the volume of immigration coverage by the AP. So here I am just plotting the number of immigrant dispatches over time, and I see no sharp change. And lastly, to return to this point of the substitutes, so what AP was suggesting is that you say enter the country without legal permission, which is impossible to use in a headline and very difficult to use in text. So what I am doing here is I am asking the question, which are the phrases that are most, so imagine I give you an AP dispatch and I erase the date and I ask you, is this published before or after the ban? So here I am plotting a statistics for how predictive each word or phrase is of a publication date before or after the ban. And as you might expect from what I showed you before, illegal immigrant is the most predictive phrase. And the phrase entered the country illegally and other similar phrases are way below in the ranking. So it seems that they do not really compensate for this drop in illegal. This is even more pronounced if you look at headlines. So there you don't actually find these phrases at all. So what this tells me is that illegal immigrants partly became immigrants who entered the country illegally, but only for a small fraction of texts. And for the remainder, illegal immigrants simply became immigrants to the AP. Okay. Then let's look at how this diffused into the language used by media outlets across the US. So I collect data on articles that mention the word immigrant from two sources, News Library and ProQuest. So this covers basically all US newspapers and a bunch of online outlets as well, for a total of 2,200 outlets. So I collect the headline, byline, first paragraph, and so on of each article that mentions the word immigrant. And the variable of interest in my regressions will be the share of immigrant articles that mention the word illegal immigrant. So I will always be normalizing by immigrant articles. Then I will be comparing this share for different media outlets. And I will differentiate between media outlets that relied on the Associated Press more or less prior to the ban. So this variable will be what I will call AP intensity. And the way I compute it is the following. I look at the sample of immigrant articles published in the 12 months before the ban, so in the pre-period. And I check how often the Associated Press is either credited. So what you should be seeing if your local newspaper is using the Associated Press is that in the first paragraph or in the byline, you will see according to the Associated Press. Okay, so that's what you should be happening. Sometimes it turns out media outlets just copy paste without attribution to the Associated Press. And for this reason, I have a second step where I do a simple plagiarism detection check. So I compare each article to the AP dispatches released in the previous day, and I flag the ones that copy verbatim a large portion of text. Good. Then my empirical strategy to study this diffusion of language is the following. I have the share of illegal immigrant articles on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, I have outlet and month-fixed effects, and the variable of interest will be the interaction of AP intensity with the dummy for post-ban. So this will be basically a diff and diff, and the assumption is parallel trends. And this is what I find. Let's start from the first column. As you can see, the coefficient on post-ban is negative and significant and quite large. So this means that the ban is somewhat of an aggregate shock. I see across the board a decrease in usage of the phrase illegal immigrant. However, this aggregate shock is somewhat stronger for outlets with high AP intensity before the ban. So that's this interaction term here. And this is robust to outlet and month-fixed effects, to state times month-fixed effects, which should capture any state-specific events or policies, and also to the inclusion of outlet-specific linear trends.
Milena, sorry to interrupt you. I believe that Pedro has a question on your parallel trend assumption, and I think you have a graph on your paper that he might want to see.
Yeah, that's coming. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
So yeah, let me actually jump straight to that. So here, instead of looking at this post-ban dummy, I can break it down into, here I do it by semester. So 6 months before, 12 months before, and so on. And the timing of the effect appears in coincidence with the announcement of the ban. Now there is somewhat of an increasing pre-trend, if anything, which yeah, I can go more into why that is, but yeah, an increasing pre-trend means that if anything, I would be underestimating this change here. Do you think that answers the question?
Oh yeah, I think so, yes, thank you.
Okay, so let me then, so another thing I can do is, because AP intensity is a continuous variable, I can split it into quartiles, and here I think it's useful to tell you also something of about the magnitude of this effect. So here I am splitting AP intensity into 4 quartiles with 0 AP intensity as the baseline category. So let's, if you look at this 4th category here, these are the outlets that copy between 120 and 760 articles from AP per 1,000 before the ban. So they use the Associated Press quite a bit. And the effect for those outlets is about 12 percentage points decrease in the share of illegal immigrant articles relative to a baseline of 21. So this is more than a 50% decline. Then another thing I can do is to ask the question, is this driven by articles that are copy-pasted from the Associated Press according to my measures? Or is it driven by the rest, which are presumably original articles? And this is the split that I do here. Blue line, original, green line, AP copied articles. And as you can see, most of the effect comes from articles copied from the Associated Press. Yes, so this effect is quite robust to alternative specifications, different ways of measuring KP. One important check that I want to mention is that a useful placebo for me is to use another newswire, Reuters, which is the second biggest one. And I find no differential effect by Reuters intensity computed in a similar way as AP. So this seems to be specific to the Associated Press rather than newswires in general. Okay. Now, what happens to other dimensions of slant? So other dimensions of language. I can do the same exercise I showed you before, but now for news outlets. So the green line computes the slant using all text, including illegal immigrant, and excluding illegal immigrant is the blue line, and that appears to be relatively unaffected, meaning, again, the diffusion seems to work very similarly to what we saw for AP's text. Similarly, as with AP's text, I find no change in the volume of immigrant articles or immigration articles. So there is no change in the volume of coverage of the issue. It's more of a change in language. So yeah, just to conclude on this diffusion part, it seems that given that media outlets copy-paste from the Associated Press without much changing much of the content, several features of AP's language kind of translate into the language used by AP-intensive media outlets. Okay, and if there are no other questions at this point, I can move on to studying what happens to readers.
Actually, there is one that just came in. So Seko is asking whether AP intensity for immigrant-specific article changes after the ban, and if media outlets could change their copy-paste behavior only for this category, keeping the others unchanged.
Okay, so I'm not sure I understood the second question.
Yeah, I think it's referring to whether or not media outlets change their behavior with respect to copy pasting from Associated Press. But yeah, it's not very clear the way it's written. I have to say.
Okay.
I don't know, Seko, could you please clarify your question, maybe? Well, in the meantime, I would actually ask you myself a question. So you've made a central point of your identification strategy, the heterogeneity in the extent to which outlets rely to Associated Press.
Yeah.
And you also have highlighted that there was some resistance to AP to adopt this. So maybe there could be some anticipation. And also that the years where the change was adopted were years of very highly politicized language. So I'm wondering whether there was any change in the reliance on AP before and after the adoption. So could you, do you have an idea of whether the membership changed or on its evolution at all?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I don't have this graph here, but I have looked at AP intensity over time, and there is somewhat of a decline after the ban, but there is not really, if I remember correctly, there is not really much of a pre-trend. So it could be that some outlets did not agree with the change, and as a result, they started using the Associated Press a little bit more. That's my interpretation. Sorry, a little bit less. That's my interpretation.
Good. I think you measure intensity like a year before. Maybe you could also try and measure it a little bit farther back in time as a check, maybe.
Yeah. So from what I have, sure, yeah, I can do this check. But from what I have seen, there is not much of a difference going back. In the extent of AP usage going back. So you see somewhat of a change, but it's after the ban. But let me maybe say something to your question on, okay, the APE was very resistant to requests and so on. That's actually exactly the reason why you see somewhat of an increasing pre-trend here. So what happens here is I am plotting the difference essentially between the outlets that are very APE intensive and the ones that are not. And what happens if you look at the raw data, in fact, maybe I can show it to you if I don't get too distracted, but this is what happens to the non-AP intensive outlets. And as you can see, they are decreasing their usage of the phrase illegal immigrant as it's becoming less and less politically correct. Okay, so you see a decline here. Whereas for the AP intensive outlets, this is quite flat. So it seems that they were quite stubborn and resistant to this up until the ban. So essentially what you see in these event studies is the difference between these two lines, and the difference is increasing for this reason. Okay,
thank you.
Good. Okay, then given that we now understand what happened to language and how the language on immigration coverage changed, we can look at the attitudes of readers. Okay, so to map, so basically I will be using a large electoral survey called the CCES, which asks a bunch of questions on immigration policy. And to map responses in the CCES to media exposure, I will be using data on newspapers and their circulation across the US. So I'll be using data on circulation by newspaper and county. And I can match this data to my data on content based on the name and city of the outlet. And to somewhat reduce measurement error, I focus on counties in which I can account with my content data, in which I can account for more than 90% of total county circulation. So I am not using any counties where I only know what happens to the smallest newspaper, but not to the bigger ones, in essence. Yeah, this is robust to alternative cutoffs. So at the end, I have 2,300 counties and 800 newspapers, and I aggregate AP intensity within a county by taking the circulation weighted average of each newspaper circulated within the county. And similarly, I can compute the circulation weighted average of the share of illegal immigrant articles. Okay, so this is how AP intensity looks like in the US. As you can see, there is quite a bit of detailed variation. And however, you may also be asking yourself what this is correlated with. So the extent to which a newspaper uses the Associated Press is not random. It might be telling us something about the characteristics of these newspapers. And indeed, I find that counties with higher AP intensity have, first of all, smaller newspapers, so lower circulation per capita. They have less of a less educated audience, and they have fewer immigrants. So yeah, I think these correlations are intuitive. So it could be that more urban places with more immigrants, perhaps they demand more high quality original content on immigration and therefore have lower AP intensity.
So you have about 10 minutes.
Okay, that sounds good. So these changes will, these differences will be, of course, important. And I will basically, in my empirical strategy, I will have to account for any possible changes in attitudes that are related to these characteristics. Okay, so my empirical strategy is the following. I will have an outcome, which will be a survey outcome at the county times survey year level. I will regress this on, I would like to regress this on on the share of illegal immigrant articles, which, however, is possibly endogenous. And therefore, I will be instrumenting this with what you saw in the previous specification. So I'll be instrumenting this with the interaction of AP intensity and post-ban. So, or alternatively, I can just show you reduced form outcome in county C, year Y on AP intensity interacted with post-ban. Okay, so just to state again, the identifying assumption is that there may be things that are correlated with AP intensity and that their effect on attitudes is changing over time. Okay, think, for example, if college education for some reason happens to make you more left-leaning exactly in 2013, that would be an issue. So for this reason, I will show you results with or without controls for these county characteristics interacted with time. Okay. Then let me also mention that this will be a local average treatment effect for complier media outlets and complier counties, meaning that these will be the newspapers and readers of those newspapers who are exposed to this change only because their local outlet follows whatever AP gives them. So this might be a particular set of newspapers, but that's what we can do here. Okay, now let me jump straight to the results. I can look at different questions on immigration separately, or I can aggregate them into an index, which I will call restrict immigration. So I am showing you here the reduced form, which suggests that readers in AP intensive outlets compared to less AP intensive outlets are less supportive of restricting immigration after the ban. They're also less supportive of border security, of hiring illegal immigrants, or of allowing the police to question illegal immigrants. In contrast, I find no significant effect on a question on whether these people should get amnesty. Okay, so this was the reduced form, or alternatively, I can express this in terms of the share of illegal immigrant articles circulated in the county. And the more illegal immigrant articles you have, the more people support restrictive immigration, border, not hiring immigrants, and questioning immigrants. Okay, so as I said, it will be quite, so now I will zoom in onto the border question, just to show you some specification checks. So as I mentioned, it will be quite important for me that this effect does not move much as I introduce controls for county characteristics interacted with time. And that's the case. So this is relatively stable to the inclusion of such controls, as well as to the inclusion of state times year fixed effects. So that tells me that this really seems to be something about AP intensity rather than something correlated with it. The timing of this change, so here I am plotting the reduced form over time. The timing, again, coincides precisely with the announcement of the ban. And it is, so here I am plotting the reduced form by discretizing AP intensity, and it's again driven by the counties with highest AP intensity.
Sorry, Milena, there are 5 minutes. Maybe you want to draw to a conclusion so that we can have a bit of discussion in the end.
Yeah. Okay. Then let me just say, lastly, this is driven by survey respondents who report that they read the newspaper frequently, as opposed to those who don't. And just to give you an idea of the magnitude, for those of you familiar with this media literature, I estimate the persuasion rate, which is how many people are convinced to change their survey response out of those who potentially could change their response. And this is between 1.5 and 3.8% for a 1 standard deviation change in AP intensity. And just to give you an idea, the persuasion rate that people have estimated for Fox News, for example, is about 15%. So this, given that this is a mild treatment, I also get a quite tiny persuasion. Okay, conclusion. I study the diffusion of newswire content across media outlets, and I actually find a quite large degree of diffusion, which is, to me, was an interesting result. And what this allows me to do is to look at, basically exploit this change in newswire language to look at what happens to attitudes. And I find the evidence consistent with the persuasive impact of language, and specifically of the term illegal immigrant. And of course, this is one experiment and one specific setting in which I am able to do this. But I see this as a proof of concept that language does seem to matter for policy preferences. Okay, so I will stop here.
Thank you. There are a few unanswered questions which I will direct to you. In the meantime, people may ask for some more maybe. So there is an unanswered question by Seku, who's asking whether it is possible that right-leaning newspaper edit only AP articles related to immigration, or if they could copy-paste also other articles. And then Jerome asked, why are you using yearly level information in the last part, whether you have also monthly data, and whether your estimate of right-leaning individuals stop to read newspapers that intensively rely on AP articles and switch to other newspapers, so, and whether that would introduce an upward bias.
Okay, I'm sorry, I got a bit lost. So one question I got was the second one, which is why I do the attitudes analysis at the year level rather than the month level. That's just because the survey is not computed very frequently. It's only conducted every 2 years. So yeah, perhaps I could use the date of the interview, but I haven't. I have done it just by year.
The other two questions seem to be, yeah, sorry. Okay.
Could you remind me of the first and the last question?
Yeah, the other two questions seem to be related to the phenomenon of right-leaning individuals or outlets shifting towards non-AP newspapers.
Aha, okay.
Maybe I can clarify the question if you want. So for the last one, yeah, I can?
Oh yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, it's Jerome. So I just wondering, so you said at the end that you obtain something which is a tiny persuasion effect, but I think this is the opposite. Given the very small, the minor change that you have in the treatment, it's quite impressive. And also, I guess that you estimate a downward bias or something which could be considered as a lower bound. And my idea is that if you have some people who stop to read some newspaper because they don't find that the content is satisfying, because they don't find the word that they are looking for, such as illegal migrant, then they can change completely and change the way they read. Maybe they can shift to another newspaper. And this is something that probably, but maybe I'm missing something that you are not capturing, right?
You're right. Yes, you're right. And I agree with you that this would be a reason why this should be or could be a lower bound. Now, whether that's realistic, that people really zoom into this one word and if they don't see it anymore, stop reading that newspaper, I don't know. My expectation is that there should not be that much of that, but I could in fact check with circulation data. So I can check whether the circulation of right-leaning newspapers that adopt this change drops after the ban. I guess that would answer your question.
Yeah, I mean, it would, yeah, thanks.
Okay, so we have a last question, because then we have to switch to the second presentation. Is by Ellie, who's asking what exactly changes after the ban, and how our outlets AP address the news on illegal migrants after the ban?
Oh, how? I guess if I interpret this correctly, this is a question on what is this substituted with, and what I find I have done some text analysis to try to understand this. What I find is that really very often illegal immigrant articles, so a text where you would see an illegal immigrant did this and that, would become an immigrant did this and that. For example, if I'm not taking up too much time, I think I could even show you an example. There you go. So for example, at the time, the issue of driver's licenses for illegal immigrants was quite prominent. And here I'm giving you one example from before the ban. So should we, for example, here we have a state law about driver's licenses to non-citizens, including illegal immigrants. Okay, then you have a month later, after the ban, the same discussion for a different state, and this becomes a discussion about immigrant driver's licenses. So this is a quite representative example of what happens actually.
So thank you. So thanks everyone, and thanks to the organizer for letting me have the opportunity to present this paper here. And I look forward to any questions or comments. This is one of the first times we are presenting the paper. So this is joint work with Isabelle from the Moto Economic and Public Policy Research in New Zealand, and with Stephen Stillman, who he's here in the chat room with us. So the title of the paper is Understanding the Origins of Populist Political Parties and the Role of External Shocks. And the title says a lot about the paper, because it truly is about understanding, about exploring the formative years of a populist political party, because there is a lot of evidence by now on what explains votes for populist political parties, on short-run fluctuations in votes for populist political parties or specific events like Brexit, but there is substantial lack of evidence on why they have emerged in the first place. And then it is about large external shocks. So we know from political scientists that crises are a recurring feature of political rhetoric and propaganda. In a way, populist leaders always try to enhance the fact that we are in a critical situation, that it is a situation of emergency. And so we want to understand if there truly is a role for large external shocks on support for and on the emergence of populist political parties. Our case study is New Zealand and the Populist Party in New Zealand, which is called New Zealand First, way before Trump decided to use the word America First. And we will try to convince you that New Zealand is actually an interesting case. And we think it's an interesting case mainly for two reasons. So the first one is that New Zealand First is quite an old, it's one of the first populist political parties in OECD countries. It was founded in 1993. And this is way before the global emergence of populism. So before Trump, before Brexit. Nowadays, almost every European country has a populist party. At the time, it wasn't like that. And so we don't have any co-found, in a way, driven by this global emergence of populism. And the second reason is that during the 80s, New Zealand experienced two large shocks, one in the area of economic opportunities, so they had structural reforms, and the other one in the area of migration, so big immigration reforms and a big change in the number of immigrants and in the composition of immigration. And more specifically, what we are going to do is we are going to study the short-run impact of these shocks on support for New Zealand First during the formative years of this party, so in 93 and 96. Then thanks to we are not only using votes for New Zealand Party as outcome variable, we will also use political opinions, beliefs, and a bunch of what we call populist attitudes, because our survey data has this very rich amount of opinions. And so we are also looking at how these shocks led individuals to change their beliefs. We are looking at the long-run persistence of this shock over time, so until very recent elections. And then in the final part of the presentation, I will briefly discuss the relative importance of different factors underlying support for populist parties, and this kind of fits in a little bit more with the theoretical debate on what drives support for populist parties. And we think that this is quite interesting and relevant to thinking about populism has been extending its reach in recent times, as we kind of show that populist support has continued even when the impact of these shocks in economic terms was kind of weaker, so until very recent times. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the literature review. It is sufficient to say here that there is this theoretical debate both in political economy and political science between those that think that economic factors are more relevant in driving votes for populists, and those who think that cultural or political backlash are more relevant. And it is sufficient to say here that most of the studies, both in political economy and political science, either use individual surveys, so individual level data, or geographical data, while we are combining the two of them, and we are looking simultaneously at an immigration shock and at an economic shock. So this will be largely the story about Winston Peters. So I suppose that most of you are not very familiar with New Zealand. So I'm going to spend a few words about describing this New Zealand First party and the shocks in New Zealand. So Winston Peters, he looks like more or less like a regular guy. He is the founder of New Zealand First, and he is the leader up to now. So there was no other leader other than Winston Peters of New Zealand First in the last almost 30 years. And he's currently the Ministry for Foreign Affairs in a government in coalition with the Labour Party. So he's no new to politics, like many other populist leaders. He was elected MP first in 1978, and then with the right-wing mainstream party, which was called in New Zealand the National Party, and he got kicked out of the cabinet. He was ministry at the time in 1992, and he was also told that he could not run for MP again with the National Party. So he ran as independent, he won, and this prompted the formation of New Zealand First in 1993. So the important thing about New Zealand First is that it's mainly a populist party. So before having very definite policy proposals, it truly is a populist party. As Boston and McLeod, they are two political scientists in New Zealand, put it. So even before building up a proper party manifesto, the party quickly developed an image as being strongly nationalistic, anti-establishment, populist. Then on policy issues, they are quite ambiguous on economic issues. They are anti-taxes but pro-public spending. They're very critical of the 80s pro-market reforms, and they are socially very conservative, so very much against immigration. And so the fact that they are mainly a populist party is also evident from this table here, in which we show, so in this column here, I hope that you can see that I'm pointing to a column. So 35% of those who voted for the New Zealand First in 1996 came from the National Party, but then 27% of them came to the Labour Party. This is according to our electoral survey data. So even if Peters was a previous national leader, it seems that voters from both the mainstream parties then voted for New Zealand First, and this is even more evident from what we see in this column here, in which more or less 10% of each electorate then started voting for New Zealand First in 1996. Okay, this is a few words on the New Zealand electoral system, and this is mainly to explain why I will be using 1996 as year for investigating the emergence of New Zealand First. And this is mainly because in 1993 in New Zealand there was a first past the post system. So the electoral competition was very tough for New Zealand First, and New Zealand First was formed just a few months before the 1993 elections. So it could not present candidates in every electorate. So in almost 12 electorates, more or less, it didn't have candidates. While in 96, the electoral law, due to a referendum, shifted to a mixed member proportional. So people could still vote for a local representative, but then votes were adjusted at the national level so that they could reflect the share of votes, of nationwide votes. And with this electoral law, New Zealand First received 13% of total votes, and it could play a pivotal role in deciding who was going to be in the government, and it decided to go with the National Party. But then later on, as I was saying before, it became part of Labour governments in 2005 and then now in 2017. Now, a few words on the shocks. As I was saying, in the 80s, New Zealand experienced quite large shocks due to structural reforms, because New Zealand by the beginning of the 80s had unsustainable fiscal and current account deficit, hyperinflation. So the Labour government decided to deregulate the economy, open capital accounts, drop subsidies to agriculture, then in a second wave privatize companies. And then the national government completed the reforms, making the labor market more flexible and reducing the welfare state. And this, the consequence of this was a large drop in the GDP, which was highly due to a drop in employment in specific industries. So manufacturing fell by 30%, agriculture also fell by a lot, and there are long-run impacts of these shocks on local communities at the economic level. The largest shock on immigration, so New Zealand, as you probably know, is a very high immigration country. Already in '86, it had 15% of foreign-born people. Most of them were of European descent. With the Immigration Act of '87, it was eliminated the preference for European immigrants, and this led to a point-based system, a point system based on immigrant skill that was introduced later in 1991. So a huge increase in the number of immigrants, so 21 from 15%, and a huge increase in the number of Asians particular. And you can see from this figure that while in the 80s you have outflows larger than inflows, this changed in the 90s with a peak in 95, 96. So our data, the New Zealand election study was fielded by the University of Auckland since 1990. And the nice feature to us is that votes expressed in the surveys are then later certified by the Electoral Commission. So there is less scope for those social desirability bias, and that we have quite detailed information on the place of residence of the subjects. So from 96 onwards, we have the mesh block in which they live, so we can relate this information to the area units in which they live, which is more or less the equivalent in New Zealand of a neighborhood, and to the labor market area, which is our unit of analysis in our main analysis. So I'm going to skip the maps for the sake of time. So this is our empirical framework, and it's a quite standard empirical framework. We have on the left-hand side votes, an indicator for vote to New Zealand first. And then we have as immigration variable for the immigration shock, the share of 5 years immigrant arrivals. Remember from the figure that that's the period in which New Zealand experienced this large immigration shock. And for the income shock, we have the log percentage decline in income that occurred between 86 and 91. So we have then, of course, a vector of individual and area unit characteristics and a vector of electorate fixed effects. Our identification strategy is quite standard too. We have shift share instruments. So the immigration, the base year of these shift share instruments is 1986, and for the immigration shock, we use the Altongian card instrument, so relying on the share of immigrants by country of birth across LMAs in 1986, and for the income shock, we rely on the distribution of 4-digit industries in each labor market area. Okay, that's it. Let's go to the results. So remember that we were going to test 4 kinds of different things. So this is our first and main result. So this is from 96. So these results hold also for 93, but they're less precise in 93 because we only have data at the electoral district level. And remember that in 93 for New Zealand, first things were kind of tougher, and they were not there in every constituency. But by 96, the impact of the shock on voting for New Zealand first is significant and positive, both for the immigration shock and for the income shock. The F statistic is quite good. This is our preferred specification, in which we add to the individual controls also the electorate district fixed effects and area unit controls. So this is robust also to adding additional controls at the individual level, like endogenous controls that are opinions, policy opinions, previous voting, and this, the impact of the shock seems to be robust to adding these types of controls. Just to give you an idea of the size of the impact of the size of the effects. Here with back of the envelope calculations, we predict voting for New Zealand first at different quartiles of the shocks. And for the immigration shock, we have a difference between the fourth and the first quartile of like 600, an increase of 600% in voting for New Zealand first. This, of course, is keeping every other variable as constant at their average values. So the first quartile immigration flows are 0.6%, while at the fourth quartile they are 2.7% of the total population. While at for the income shock we have a 300% increase, and the first quartile we have an income loss of 0.6, at the first quartile of almost 7% of income loss.
Sorry to interrupt you, Eugenio.
No, interrupt me at any time.
Ellie was asking why the effects explode in the third column, the preferred specification that you showed in the previous table. If you can elaborate on that a little bit, please.
Here we are adding many more controls, and we are in a way we're getting more. They're just more precise in the sense that we are controlling for every area unit characteristics like income, unemployment rate, employment rate, population, Gini index, proportion with school qualifications, vocational qualifications, the age structure of the area unit, and that's the main reason, I guess, that we are taking away some confounds.
Also, Steve pointed it out in the chat as well. So thanks.
Okay. Okay. Then we were a little bit concerned that this kind of result may have been driven not by populism per se, but by the policy platform of New Zealand First. And so we decided also to understand what was the impact of these shocks on the other parties and on participation to vote. And we were specifically concerned about Alliance. So Alliance was a far left party. It came out of the Labour Party, specifically in opposition to these reforms that were enacted in the 80s. And so we really were concerned about this. There was even talks about an alliance between the Alliance Party and New Zealand First before the 96 elections. But it seems that the impact of the shocks is truly specific to New Zealand First. And we don't find any significant effect on the other parties. On Alliance, we even have the opposite sign, but very high standard errors anyway. Then, as I was telling you, we also looked at different opinions, policy opinions, populist attitude, the personal feelings about leaders, the importance of different topics. And so here on the columns you will find our shocks, and each row is one model. So we replicate our preferred specification. So the third column of this table on each of these dependent variables. So on each of these opinions coded between 0 and 1, so that we can compare the size of the coefficients. And what we find is quite interesting, because the immigration shock and the income shock, on one side, they seem to have quite separate impact on opinion. So the immigration shock, quite consistently with being on an immigration shock, made people more hostile to immigration. It made them think that defense and law and order issues are more relevant. So it seems that immigration had an impact in part on through kind of security issues, and the income shock had an impact. So it made people more in favor of redistribution. It made them think that unemployment is a more relevant topic, in part at the expenses of economic growth. But then what we found truly interesting is that both shocks have an impact on what we call populist attitude. So it made them think that, made people think that a strong leader is needed, and they made them mistrust parties, the mainstream parties, more with coefficients that are comparable in size to our main analysis on voting for New Zealand first. So it seems that there is something about populist attitudes, and there is something about the impact of these shocks on beliefs that may explain why people voted for New Zealand first. In the long run persistence of these shocks, what we did here is just to see if the shocks have an impact on voting for New Zealand first in following years, so in 1999, 2002, up to 2014. And here we pool all our sample, all the waves of the election study from 1999 to 2014. And it seems that there is some persistence to these shocks. So they are both significant in 1999. The income shock is still persistent in 2002, and both of the shocks seem somehow to re-emerge. The immigration shock in a more significant way in 2014. Here it is positive but not significant. And then interestingly, it seems that the impact of the shocks is amplified when New Zealand first is in opposition. So this is done with a dummy that takes the value of 0, of 1 if New Zealand first is in opposition during that election year. And here you see that the interaction is significant and positive. While quite surprisingly, but this is quite weak, the interaction is negative when with the change in unemployment rate between the year of the election and the year before. But again, this is not so weird considering that New Zealand first is its strength. As I told you before, it's very ambiguous on the economic, on its economic platform. Then we try to understand what are the mechanisms underlying the impact of these shocks that were again very large shocks, and we examine heterogeneity by age, gender, occupation, a lot of individual characteristics, and we don't find a lot. So we only find significant interactions for high population density areas where the shocks have little impact. So this is quite consistent with previous evidence, especially on the impact of the presence of immigrants on voting. So we see basically that in large urban areas where the population density is higher, these shocks have little impact, while in more rural areas they have a higher impact. Here we also try, this is kind of a suggestive analysis. We try we do some heterogeneity analysis by opinions. Of course, this is all endogenous because we cannot claim that these opinions are exogenous to voting for New Zealand first. So on the columns, we have the variable, the opinion for which we are calculating the interactions with the shocks, because the dependent variable here is always voting for New Zealand first. And we do find some significant interactions. And also some interesting cross-influence in a way. You see that people who are more hostile to immigration, they they seems to be those for, it's for them that the impact of the shock is amplified. So this interaction absorbs the whole shock, and the same goes for here for people who want to reduce taxes. So the effect of the immigration shock is lowered for people who want to reduce taxes. But you see
sorry to interrupt you, Eugenio. You have about 15 minutes.
Yeah, no problem. I don't have a lot of slides left, so there will be, I think, plenty of time for discussion. So you can see here that so the impact of the income shock is lower for people who are right-leaning. It's higher for people who are in favor of redistribution, and for people who think that recent policies were bad for the country, for people who mistrust both traditional mainstream parties, and for people who have good feelings, so who highly trust Winston Peters. And the impact of the immigration shock is lower again for people who want to reduce taxes, and is higher for people who think that recent policies were bad for the country. So to wrap up and to go to a very short discussion and to the last part of the paper. So up to now we gathered evidence that large shocks have an impact. They also have a long run impact on political preferences and opinions, and they favor the emergence of populism. But then some political scientists, they argue that there are explanations other than economic ones that matter more. And basically they put forward two arguments. One argument is that beliefs may matter independently from economic shocks. And the other one is that there may be a role for economic shocks, but the explanatory power of these shocks may be low compared to other factors. So for example, to demographic factors or to opinions, disenchantment towards democracy and things like that. So what we do, so we have seen from the previous analysis that in fact, it truly seems that economic factors are highly intertwined with political factors in explaining the impact of the shocks on voting for New Zealand First. Then we also find, so I don't have time to, I didn't put them in the slide, we have some evidence that beliefs may matter independently from economic shocks, so it's not strictly causal analysis, but exploiting the panel dimension of this New Zealand election study. We found some evidence that feelings for Winston Peters and mistrust towards party are relevant independently from economic shocks. And then on the explanatory power of the shocks, what we do is, well, it's summarized in this graph. Basically, we compute the partial R squared for groups of variables. We have two models here, a baseline model in which we only put the shocks and some socio-demographic and economic characteristics, and a full model in which we add also all kinds of opinions and the ideology of the subject. Then we compute the difference between the R squared of these models and which you see here in red for the baseline model and in blue for the full model. And we compute the difference between the R squared of this model and the partial R squared for these subgroups of variables. And what we find is that it's true that the shocks alone don't explain, of course, they are not the only explanation, but it seems that other subgroups of variable don't explain much more than the shocks. So only the demographic characteristics. Here you have age, the immigration status, and the ethnicity of the subject explain a little bit more. What really stands out here is the role played by feelings on politicians. So if people like Winston Peters and if people dislike the leaders of the mainstream parties, this seems to explain a lot of the variability in votes. That's it. So to conclude, so the impact of the shocks seems to be quite large, and it seems to persist over time. So it seems to have at first encouraged people to vote for New Zealand first when the party first came on the scene. But then it seems that it was there. It helps explain why people vote for New Zealand first 20 years later. And they are particularly salient when New Zealand first is in opposition. It seems that these shocks also led people to be more hostile toward immigrants, demand more for a distribution, and this is clearly relevant for how we think our democratic space at increasing populist beliefs, so demand for a strong leader, distrust toward traditional parties. Last but not least, and this resonates with what political scientists who work on populist political communication say, it seems that personal feelings towards the party leader, so liking Winston Peters in this case it really matters a lot. It amplifies also the impact of the shocks. In a way, there is no voting for a populist party if you don't like the populist leader and if you don't dislike the mainstream leader, the mainstream party's leaders. So thank you, and I look forward for your comments and questions.
Okay, so there were a few questions asked in the chat, but they appear to have been answered by Steve. So
okay.
if, okay, here are other two questions. Maybe, Ellie, you could unmute yourself and ask them directly. But before you do, I would like to remind everybody that the chat is going to be handed to the speakers, so they will receive your questions. And if you have further questions, you could contact them directly. Thank you. Please go ahead, Ellie.
Yeah, thank you, Giuseppe. Let me put the video. Yes, thank you, Eugenio, for the presentation. It was super interesting. So basically, I have my main question is about the characterization of whether this party is populist or not. And I think that it might be, I mean, what we might be capturing is actually the fact that it represents a new political offer. So because you said it has been created in 1993, just in response to the economic shock, immigration shock. So it has, due to that, it has a political advantage. It has no reputation. It starts with a blank slate. So I'm wondering whether you, I mean, it's, yeah, whether how you can test that, or I know if you thought about that.
Well,
and the second one, very quick, is maybe you have done this in the paper, is could you show some voting pattern of the treated count of your treated places before 1993? I mean, during the pre-shock period. That would be nice placebos to support your IV, to show that you're before the shock, basically your treatments do not have any effect on the voting pattern. Of course, does not exist. The party does not exist, but at least that there is no, systematic difference in the voting pattern. Yeah, thank you.
No, thank you for your comments. So we haven't checked, starting from your second question, we haven't checked on in a way, on the pre-trends at the electoral level. Of course, the party is new, but yeah, it could be an interesting addition. We thought that this slide, which showed that I don't know if this partly answers your question, so that so people who voted in previous elections, so in the 1990 election when New Zealand First was still not there, that they voted, of course they voted different parties. We show here that people from more or less all parties voted for New Zealand First in 1996. Which goes to show that there is no clear political base before in 1990 to the New Zealand First electorate. To your first question, New Zealand First was not the only party coming up in 1996. And why is that? It is because in 1993, you had this referendum that that changed the electoral law to a mixed member proportional. So it opened up a political space in a way for a lot of different parties to enter the political scene in New Zealand. It was really sort of a watershed in a way in New Zealand. And also, for example, the Alliance Party I was speaking about, this far left party, it was formed in 1990. So it was still quite recent in 1996. But then you had all kind of different parties, both on the left side and on the right side, that were new in 1996, but it seems that New Zealand First was the only true populist parties in this competition, in this new competition with many new parties. I don't know if I have satisfied in a way your comments. I hope so.
Well, if that is the case, thank you very much, Eugenio, for your presentation. I think that maybe Sarah wants to say something about our next session. Thanks again to both you speakers. Have a nice day.
Eugenio, just if you could unshare your screen so I can put up a few announcements. Great. So can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Sorry.
Great. So just as a reminder, for our next session is going to be in 2 weeks, so June 29th. We will have two nice papers on migration and the economics of the household. So first, we're going to have Zibin Huang from the University of Rochester. And secondly, we're going to have Obeid Hur-Rehman from University of Michigan. So just as we said before, the guest speakers will receive all the exchanges that were made by chat, and the videos will be available on our website soon, most probably tomorrow or before the end of the week. If you have any feedbacks on our seminar, please let us know. We have a form for that on the website. And then if you want to submit a paper and present in the seminar, we're full for this semester, so our last session is going to be on July 13. But since we've received quite a lot of audience and we would like to renew the experience, we have free slots available starting from September. So if you're interested in presenting next semester, please feel free to send in your contribution. So that's it for today. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.